You see, the word honor, or onur in Turkish, is a very heavy word. Yeah? It's almost stifling. And it brings to mind concepts such as nationalism, jingoism, patriotism, either dying in the name of your country or killing in the name of your country. And certainly this was not the subject of my book. And onur in Turkish is also a name given to children, but only to boys, not to girls. So boys carry on usually that concept of honor. And therefore, in the Turkish edition, we decided to name the book Iskender, which was one of the name of the central character in the book, who eventually murders his own mother in the name of honor. And then the book came out in England. Just before it was published, my English publisher said, "You know, I love this book, but I have a problem with its title." She said, "There's no way we can call this book Iskender or Alexander, because for the British people, Alexander means Alexander the Great, and they're going to think this is a book about warfare, history, expansion, conquest, and my book had nothing to do with those things. So what shall we name it?" I asked, and she said, "Honor. Why don't we name it Honor? Because it's such a nice word." And there it was, Honor. And then the book went to Italy. And now my Italian publisher said, "I love this book, but I have a problem with its title." She said, "If we name it Honor or Onore, people are going to think it's about the mafia." So the Italian readers will be very anxious that it's a novel by a Turkish novelist about the Italian mafia. And in the end, we decided to name that book The House of the Four Winds, which is the title, which is the name of the Kurdish village in the story. And I don't want to go on and on and on, but suffice to say, that particular book, unlike my other novels, wherever it went, its name had to be shifted, changed, altered a little bit. And that was quite interesting for me, just because the concept of honor meant different things to different people as you moved from one culture to another. That's why I wanted to start with this little anecdote. As a writer as a storyteller who commutes between cities and languages, obviously I'm very interested in stories, but I'm also interested in silences, the things we do not or we cannot talk about. So that includes taboos, political taboos, sexual taboos, cultural taboos, the things we have to whisper about and cannot really speak about comfortably in the public space. I like to pay attention to such linguistic barriers and pay attention to concepts that can't be translated directly from one language to another. And then I ask myself, why is it like that? So I want to share with you another anecdote. I was a very young writer when I came to Hay Festival for the first time many, many years ago. And I remember stopping by this road sign and feeling very surprised, just because that road sign here in Hay was written in two languages, in Welsh and in English. Coming from Turkey, I'd never seen anything like that before. I'd never seen a road sign in Turkish and Kurdish. But why not? Why can't we do that? In fact, in Turkey, we do just the opposite. We alter the names of Kurdish villages, we Turkify their names, or we do the same thing to Armenian villages. But what also stayed with me from that first visit was, at the end of a book signing, a very kind, charming lady came to me, and she asked me if I was going to see the countryside. And I said, "I don't have time, I'm going back to London the next day." And she said, "Oh, well, what a shame." And I had to stop for a minute, because, again, coming from Turkey, the word shame to me is such a heavy word. Shame, dishonor. We don't use it lightly. We don't use it in this way. So these are little anecdotes that I want to share with you, because sometimes these concepts are not the same thing. They don't resonate in the same way as you move from one culture to another. For us, especially in very patriarchal, sexist, and homophobic societies, shame is usually something that women carry. And you have to be very careful about that. Don't sit in a certain way, don't open your legs if you're in a public bus, public transportation. Ayıp. It's shame. Don't laugh loudly. It's ayıp. It's shameful. Again, always shame associated with women, with womanhood. But the interesting thing about shame used in this way, it's always about the gaze of the other, what people think about you, how they're going to judge you. So I was intrigued by the heaviness of the word shame in Turkey and this relatively light way in which it can be used in this country and elsewhere. The French philosopher, anthropologist, and sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, he has a very interesting work on the concept of honor in Algeria. And he talks about a very similar thing, how the concept itself is perpetuated from one generation to another. And scholars like Richard Nisbet have taken this study, they have been inspired by this study, and they developed another approach, and they call it cultures of honor. And they do claim that some societies are very much dominated by these cultures of honor. And in such societies, the gaze of the society is internalized by the individual to the point that there's no room for individuality anymore. And I want to give you some examples. I used to teach in different universities in the States and also in Turkey. And when you look at young people, 19 years old, 20 years old, it's amazingly similar in terms of their dreams, their frustrations, their expectations, more or less the same, whether it's in Istanbul or in Michigan. But in one respect, there was a big, big difference. When I would give readings to my students in Turkey, they would come back the next week, having read everything very carefully, because that's the code. If the teacher gives you homework, you do it. You have to have that discipline. But they were very unwilling to talk about the subject. Whereas the students in Michigan, they would come back a week later, having not read anything, but very willing to talk about the subject. And I was always intrigued by this difference. How do we gain our confidence, and how do we lose our confidence? I go to schools a lot, both in Turkey, in the UK, and that gives me a chance to talk to children and teenagers, young people of different age groups. To me, it's very sad and heartbreaking to see, especially how in Turkey, when I talk to children, 7 years old, 8, 9 years old, it's amazing to see how much chutzpah they have, how much courage, imagination. You ask them if any of them would like to become poets or writers, and so many of them have their hands up. They do want to become artists, girls and boys, and they're really full of creativity. But then I go to high schools in Turkey, and then I ask them the same question, if any of them would like to become poets or writers. And now there are no more hands going up. And more interestingly, girls are very unwilling to talk and share their views. Usually male students ask you questions, but female students, after they have hit puberty, something has happened to these girls. They have lost their confidence, and they take a step back. Now they're very much aware of their body and of the eye of the society constantly watching them and judging them. And they do know that it's ayıp, it's shame, and they can bring dishonor. So I have seen how this works and how it kills people's creativity in only a matter of a few years as we move from childhood to teenage years.